Alright, and we are live. So today we're going to be talking about another age-old question that's become popular all over again, and that's the question of what's the difference between sex and gender. This one is pretty frequently brought up depending on what circle you're in. Like I've seen my work and I've seen other like the government issue statements on this stuff, so thought it'd be a good idea to take a crack at answering this. So, what were your guys' thoughts going into this podcast?
Well, first I'll just say that age old is generous because I don't think gender was thought of didn't exist before 1960. So
Exactly.
I guess for us it's age
In
old, but
internet years, it's ancient.
yeah, in terms of human existence, this is like
I mean,
barely.
gender is a new way of describing it, but like the ideas of femininity and masculinity, as most people understand gender to be, are definitely age old. People were worried
True.
about effeminate men, at least in Greek times, which is pretty well our oldest recorded history.
Yeah, and so I guess I'll also start off with some thoughts before. I think the terminology, like going into this, like I had already kind of looked into trying to nail down like the difference, what the proposed difference between sex and gender was, blah blah blah, just because I found it confusing, and I'd taken actually a course in psychology on sex and gender, and even in there, like I feel like that time period was the least confusing, or least confused I was on the terms, and then the terms as they were used, and that was only like 2016, have like completely moved around since then. So the 2016 definitions are totally outdated and don't like work anymore. I think it's like intentionally confusing. Like there is a certain amount of time and effort put into changing the terms around, adding terminology, to obscure it, and just like I guess the quote unquote 2016 uh, academic psychology course, the way things were kind of defined were, sex is your born biological uh, sex, and that was due to your chromosomes, which generated your phenotype, and there you go, voila. And gender was basically like, as Price was saying, essentially like your masculine femininity, your felt sex, or your felt, um, essentially your felt sex was how it was defined. So, and so you could be um, that's where that's how it was explained in psychology, was like transgenders were men who felt like women, or women who felt like men. Sex to gender, very simple. That was about the extent that it was really explained at, and I thought that made a little bit of sense, but since then that seems to be outdated and definitely not how it's used anymore. And I guess the rest of it is, I think the reason, like the whole move towards gender being, there can be more than three now, you're up to dozens of genders, etc., spectrum. I think it gives you it gives the people who claim to understand it some power. So that's why they make it so obscure and confusing, so that even people that try to learn about it have can't make heads or tails out of it. That's about all I had.
Yeah, I also took a academic gender course. I think mine was in 2017, but the book was the worst book I've had in my academic career, and I don't think it had been changed since about 2014 when it was first written. And I would say that that was a net negative to my understanding of how people use the word gender, because the stuff they explain in that sort of course is either common sense, like masculine and feminine, or nonsense that's often derived from philosophy rather than science, which isn't really the point of psychology. So usually they attempt to use scientific method on less hard aspects of life. So it was a very bad course, and I had discussions with my professor, who also did not think it was a great course, despite the fact she was teaching it. So it's not a field that makes very much sense at all. And I think that a lot of people in academia get basically grant money thrown at them to rehash topics that have already been covered in other fields of psychology, just under the guise of gender. And then I think outside of academia, people have a lack of meaning in their lives, and they try to fill that void with gender in the way that they would have tried to use, say, a personality type back in the day, before personality in psychology has become quite stale because the systems that work aren't as interesting. So you still see people talking about Myers-Briggs and such because they don't do anything effectively, but they're more cool than the ones that matter. And gender has become, for normal people, I think, sort of one of those cool things to define themselves as and talk about at cocktail parties or wherever they meet.
For me, I think I had some of the same thoughts that you guys did. One of the main things that I felt going into this was gender seemed to me as like a catch-all for personality types now. You know, people say that, at least from like my experience with like seeing stuff on the internet, but also, you know, some people around me, it just seemed like people were trying to use gender as a new way to form an identity that just seems like personality traits. Like, a lot of it to me didn't make any sense from any sort of scientific, like a rigorous academic or scientific perspective. Like, it just seemed like somebody was assigning themselves personality traits and then passing that off as something else. It just seemed like a really meaningless thing to me at this stage. I also felt like a lot of the gender stuff has been used as a tool to confuse people and attack people if if they step out of lines for certain things. I think a great example of that was J.K. Rowling. She had said stuff, that was not considered to be within that, like, was beyond the pale for gender and transgenderism, and people were trying to get her completely canceled, which obviously didn't work, but I felt that was quite interesting to watch. But yeah, that was about it, other than what you guys have said. So do we want to just jump right into what sex itself is? Because I think that's probably the easiest and most clear-cut thing that we'll deal with today. So I think, Hubbard, that was mostly your area of expertise.
Yeah, I mean, this is like one of the things that um it just seems when you like read about evolutionary biology and stuff, that's makes gender so much more confusing because it just doesn't fit into the story at all. So I just like went back to some basics and was just, refreshing myself on sex, essentially as it evolved. And I didn't know some of this, but obviously, like bacteria, like most bacteria, I guess, and the first bacteria and first organisms didn't sexually reproduce and didn't have sexes. They were copy and replicate, reproduction, asexual reproduction of just, they copy themselves. So they were basically forming twins of themselves, and there was no differentiation. And in terms of like two different sexes or multiple sexes, just copy and replicate. And about two-ish billion years ago, some form of algae started to sexually reproduce, and as far as I understand it, there was like spores or some sort of thing that is essentially the male sexually reproducing thing being let off, and then it would get carried by the water, just like literally carried in the water to other algae, which had receptors, and they would mate essentially, and that was first sexual reproduction. And then it was like 400 million years ago where you had internal fertilization, and it was in fish. So that would have been where you actually had a male with putting sperm into a female with eggs. And yeah, so 400 million years ago. And what, even Darwin realized was that there had to be some sort of um, mechanism that would differentiate the sexes in evolution. And he wrote a big chunk of his one of his books was on sexual selection, and that's sexual selection is pretty much the primary driving force behind sexual dimorphism. And sexual dimorphism basically just being physiological and behavioral differences between male and females. So you'll obviously there's a whole range, right? You can think of a million size differences, um, even just certain equipment, right? Like say you take insects, some beetles have big pincers in the males that are completely absent in the females. No analogous structure whatsoever. And then you have behaviors, totally different behaviors between male and females, all part of the dimorphism. And this primarily stems uh, from gamete size differences, gametes being sperm and eggs in humans, because females almost always, because they have the larger gamete, they invest more in offspring because the egg is much more expensive to produce, and that's led to basically there's a whole evolutionary game theory where the more you go towards high investment, low reproduction strategy, it spirals. And so, in almost all species, females will invest quite a bit more in offspring due to that. And that means that there is asymmetries between males and females, which will lead to males and females selecting different traits in partners when they go to reproduce. So what a female finds attractive in a male will not be the same as what a male finds attractive in a female. There will be an asymmetry in what they find attractive and what they choose in a mate. And as that goes over time, males and females drift apart due to them selecting these differences in traits. And you see it all throughout the animal kingdom, and even in some non-animals, there's a bit of it, but yeah, primarily in the animal kingdom, you see it all throughout the animal kingdom. Invertebrates, females are actually larger, and that's usually because offspring require more resources for reproduction, and therefore the females are usually going to grow larger to support the basically egg production. Vertebrates is a lot more complicated. One thing to note in vertebrates is that there's a lot of emphasis on, in addition to sexual selection, there being other mechanisms that cause sexual dimorphism, and that ranges from like mating systems to population density. So there's a bunch of different factors influencing sexual dimorphism in vertebrates. So it's not just sexual selection, which is important because it can cause different types of dimorphism. And then that runs the gambit. So you have, say, sharks. Females are a lot larger in sharks most of the time. Birds, there's multiple differences: plumage, size, other notable differences. And one of the big ones to emphasize, and one of the big kind of consistencies throughout different species, is dimorphism increases when intrasexual competition increases. So the more intrasexual competition, so competition within males or within females, for mates of the opposite sex, the more dimorphic the animals usually are. And in primates, That generally translates to it's almost always male in intrasexual competition, so men competing for access to female mates, and that means that say in primates, the males are usually larger. They're usually an emphasis on upper body strength. Um, they they have oftentimes uh, like for humans, for example, they have broader shoulders, narrow hips, larger hearts and lungs, and almost all of that is at least in part related to intrasexual competition. So humans are dimorphic, obviously, and they're noticeably dimorphic. They're not as dimorphic as some other primates, including our direct ancestors, Homo erectus and Neanderthalis. Um, and another thing to note on that intrasexual competition, that's related to the levels of polygyny. Basically, uh, the more uh, the more often that small numbers of males dominate mating, the more intersexual competition there is, and the more dimorphism there is. So humans and primates and almost all mammals are polygynous to a certain degree, varying degrees, essentially.
And
And
also in humans specifically, it's varied a lot throughout the millennia, I guess, the eras, because during the early agrarian era, there's some estimates that put the average male reproducing with 16 females. So that would leave about 15 males out in the cold, which is still it's hard to conceptualize, but that's the one of the leading theories.
Well, I know that the average is that you have twice as many female ancestors as you do male. So
Well, it's
overall,
about
it's
like
like
the modern, yeah, that's a more is
well,
in the recorded history a more
yeah,
normal ratio.
there's that's every individual has the same number of female and male ancestors, but in
yeah,
the human gene
yes.
pool, we should clarify that there it seems there's about twice as many female ancestors in the total gene pool as males, and that is totally congruent with you having one male and one female ancestor all the way through. Just means that yes, depending on the era that and the culture, um, there was varying degrees of polygyny. Sometimes quite low, sometimes quite high. I mean, and you can look at I think in almost every era you can look at specific examples of that happening, like Genghis Khan, is legendary, having some. I think the estimates. I don't know if they're accurate, but I've seen estimates that he has tens of millions of descendants, essentially direct descendants in the modern era.
Yeah. Well, because the big thing with Genghis Khan that makes those believable is that not only did he presumably have thousands of offspring, but many of those offspring then went on to rule their own empires or kingdoms or
Mm-hmm.
countries, and then themselves have hundreds of offspring. So,
Exactly. So and that's like in every era you see that where you have kings who have multiple wives or concubines and in certain cultures not
the
even one.
Ottomans did a real number on their gene pool because they would have a harem for the Sultan that would take from the upper classes and have hundreds of females from the upper classes in his harem, which obviously doesn't have time to reproduce with all those females. And they would also have the males from the upper classes would get castrated to guard the harem. And it's like this is a very bad idea from a genetic point of view.
For diversity's sake. True. Uh, so a- and that sexual dimorphism is really all we care about in terms of differentiating between male and female, right? And it all comes back to gametes. So sperm versus egg, and you can look at the biology. You have what codes for male versus female. You have your sexual chromosomes determines that in utero, and then as you throughout developmental cycle, you have your um, I'm blanking on the word, hormones um, that cause developmental changes, differentiations, and then you get your phenotypes, right? That's what sex is. It's just our convenient terminology for the fact that there's these two different gametes, and there's a whole slew of consequences from there being two different gametes and associated mating strategies and dimorphism, but that's all it is. So it's not. I think like when you phrase it in that way, and you get into the evolution of it and the just the logic behind it, it's pretty clear. Like there is exceptions to the rules in the sense like there is, um, you know, chromosomal disorders or whatever, and you see a lot of people clinging to that as like, oh well, this proves that male and female aren't real or not. They're not.
Yeah, they are
Uh,
constructed, or they're spectrums. That's the one I kept running into. Is
and it's like that's not the case. It's like there's still just two gametes, and even if you could, I've actually tried to look into this and never got a clear answer. I don't think there is humans that can produce both gametes, but even if they could, that doesn't negate the category of male gamete, female gamete. The
and
fact that someone can produce both types of gamete doesn't
yeah, it does not
negate
invalidate the
classification
categories
system.
entirely. Yeah, it's just that's kind of what I see is, oh, because there is intersex, so people can have both male and female chromosomes like XXY. Therefore, all you can just throw out all of sex as like a bimodal thing completely. You know, it's
Yeah,
really weird.
and it really is just bimodal. Like it's the same reason that just because there's even the sense like just because people are born infertile or people become infertile doesn't mean that that negates the fact of where the sexual dimorphism came from. Like it's just
Exactly.
completely crazy to think that because sometimes yeah, there's exceptions or there's um, developmental hiccups or the developmental process isn't perfect or there's genetic mistakes, etc., that these aren't useful classifications. They're just our classifications that accurately describe the world and how reproduction works. And I mean, yeah, so that's when we come into gender, which is an attempt, I guess, started as an attempt to make things clearer or add clarity or add classification or add like an additional classification or variable in order to capture things like quote unquote like that sex didn't capture. And I guess we can kind of run through what has been shuffled under the umbrella of gender, but it's pretty extensive at this point what falls under the scope of gender.
And I think I'm not 100% certain because I was reading a bunch of articles on where it came from. But when it was developed in the latter half of the 20th century as a concept, I'm pretty certain it was used to describe the socially constructed results of sex, to differentiate between sex, obviously being, as we've discussed, the biological aspect, and then gender being how you're treated or expected to perform or perceived in society. And that is actually rejected by a large group of academics who just say sex influences how you go through your life, so you don't need gender. But I think gender was an attempt to make that distinction clear, which some people don't think needs to even be cleared up.
Yeah, you'll I think this is actually accurate, is John Money um coined it, and it was during his work on hermaphrodism.
Yeah, and
And
um, when I looked up like transgender history, it actually predates gender as a concept. So there's like some intensive studying of transgenderism going on scientifically in the 20s and 30s. long before the term gender.
Yeah, and now we get into a litany of different uses for gender. I don't know if either one of you guys wants to attempt to.
I mean, I'll give you the simple, commonly understood definition straight out of Wikipedia. That is that gender is the range of characteristics pertaining to and differentiating between femininity and masculinity. And I think that pretty much sums up how average people understand gender.
Yeah, a definition that I got was gender refers to the continuum of complex psychosocial self-perceptions, attitudes, and expectations people have about both sexes. And that's kind of, I think it's a little bit more of a wordy and complicated way, unreasonably so, to just say the same thing. Like, it's the differences between how men and women are, like, you know, like how
Work in society.
yeah, like just how like how
Exist in
their
society.
biology and their culture intermingle to produce, the femininity and masculinity.
Yeah, I guess that would be. I think if a common person did have any understanding of the term gender, and this is kind of was my understanding of gender. When
Prior
I
for
hadn't looked into it, was like,
drinking the fire hose.
well, yeah, like the masculine femininity thing, which would, I guess, in most people's mind, just be like your um, stereotypical male phenotype and stereotypical female phenotype, right? Like this, including the behaviors and attitudes and um, all that stuff, right?
Yeah, so like
And
whether you're a sissy or a tomboy, as like commonly used terms that would identify a masculine woman or a feminine male.
and you can get like really deep into the weeds, but yeah, it does essentially boils down to how you behave, right? And um, that, based on whether or not your behavior matches typical behaviors. And to give the devil the due, like there, if you do look cross culture, a lot of what we define as masculine or feminine behavior is essentially culturally dependent, right? And that even you can even look into individual cultures and see over time as that changes. So I think that is where a lot of the kernel of truth, the um, that a lot of this stuff is based on is humans are extremely um, culturally dependent creatures, and a lot of our behavior and whatnot does vary culture to culture and is learned, um, you know, and can be malleable to a certain degree, right? So that I yeah, I guess we can get into this a little later, but I don't know why we needed a new word for that. But
Yeah,
um,
and I think the one that like comes to mind for most Westerners is like our current understanding of masculine and feminine is very based on what arose out of the Industrial Revolution, which is the system of the man being the breadwinner and the woman being the homemaker. Because we had a society that all of a sudden had those needs, and the existing sexual dimorphism led towards men obviously working in manual labor in factories and mining, and women therefore taking care of the home by themselves because the man was out working for 16 hours a day. And while that's changed, I think that's still the dominant paradigm that people would identify if asked.
yeah, and I think that's where the nuance comes back in conversation, right? Where a lot of these, say, particular behaviors or roles or quote unquote social constructions of and cultural attitudes of the genders, it's all rooted in biology, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it wasn't coin flip, complete accident that men were the factory workers and women were the um, in charge of childcare in the Industrial Revolution. It's not like that could have gone either way. It was up
Yeah,
for
it's
debate.
well,
It was an inevitable consequence of biology
Yeah.
That's the way it went.
One of the things that people probably need to look at is when you look at cultures across the whole world, they're going to vary very differently in many of the in quote unquote gender roles, right? But there are many things that they don't vary in. Like certain manual labor tasks and certain hunting tasks are almost always, if not always, done by men. And we're talking across every culture that they've studied across Earth for the history that they've been able to dredge up so far. Like there are certain things that women do, and there are certain things that men do, and then there's a decent chunk of variety in there. Like I can't remember the one group, the weavers are always men, and in other cultures the weavers are always women. So that's something that could have gone either way and did go one way in at various points in time for different cultures. But there are certain things. Big game hunting has always been men. There might be some like things here or there that crop up, but like 99.99999% it's been men. And
And that's always important to bear in mind is that it's always about in general. It's like, yes, a woman may have been a warrior, may have been a hunter, may have been doing all of the things that are stereotypically masculine, but it doesn't change the fact that the gender role in that society was that was a masculine task.
Yeah,
it just may have been a woman that did it.
There's just one exception to hundreds of thousands of people over tens of 20 30,000 years, right? It's just because there is one exception doesn't mean you get to throw the whole damn thing out.
Well, and I think it's not even that we have to rely on humans. There's also a lot of analogous things that we look at in animals that fall the same way, right? And the big one being, if you look at childcare, women have in all societies, this is one of those ubiquitous ones, in all societies, women have always taken on the larger childcare role. And, you look over at animals, it's the same thing,
Yeah.
right? Especially our close, mammals and our, especially primates, it's the same thing. It's always
For certain
females.
species, right? Like for most mammals, yeah. Exactly.
Well, yeah, it's,
Well, that's the
and
same thing. Is that like people will point to? I think it's the seahorse where
Yeah.
males take care of the child, and it's like, yes, one example. Yes, there is one example.
Yes,
It
you
can
don't.
happen.
Human beings do not live under the ocean, and or
Well, like
some
it
form of.
can
Are
by
they?
evolutionary fluke happen, but it's just not the norm.
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, and especially when you look at close relatives, right? Especially mammals. It all the animal observations fall exactly in line with what you'd expect. And so, uh, yeah, I think going back to what I was saying before about like why do we need gender? Um, so a lot of the specific uses of gender I've seen are say gender role. So they'll say, this is this is the you know typical roles that quote unquote men and women or male and female are supposed to inhabit. It's like, why can't you just use sex role for that terminology? And just because there's people that are of one sex that don't fit the role, that doesn't negate it. It doesn't negate the terminology. And I don't know how gender is any cleaner.
Yeah,
Like,
no, that's the perspective of the academics who don't like using the term gender because, yeah, as you're saying, sex role serves exactly the same purpose because the role you're expected or perceived to be performing in society is not based on gender. It's based on your sex that people observe and determines your physical characteristics.
and you say, well, that's, people say, oh, well, there's transgender people who, don't identify, blah, blah. It's like, well, it doesn't matter. Like, there's always going to be people who don't identify with the quote unquote sex role of their birth. Like, there's also, if you use the term gender, there's also going to be the exact same problem of people not identifying with the gender role of their birth. Like, all the quote unquote, discrimination, or I don't know what you call it, hurt feelings that you're trying to avoid. In that case, I just don't see how you're avoiding them. Like, it's the same thing. And what gender adds to that conversation, I don't see it.
Well, and then gender gets really confusing because we've stuck to the simple, understandable definitions. But this is coming from Encyclopedia Britannica, and they call gender identity an individual's self-conception as a man or woman, or as a boy or girl, or as a combination of man boy and woman girl, or as someone fluctuating between man boy and woman girl, or as someone outside those categories altogether. And then it's like, well, what is someone outside those categories? What does that even mean for society, for how you treat someone, for how they view themselves in the world? It's like, if there's gender roles and they're male or female, then they can be interchangeable sex roles because that makes sense. But now all of a sudden you're the W role. It's like,
So yeah,
nobody
exactly. It's like
knows
what
that is. That doesn't exist.
like what well then they say it's like I do my own role, like I invent my own role.
But it's like you can't expect society to understand when you're explicitly giving yourself a role that society doesn't have for you, like in existence. How can society treat you when you're saying that you aren't in that part of society? Like it sort of becomes. I didn't find any explanation that made this less confusing, basically.
Well, and it goes back to what is sex? It's just a classification. And so, like, I think that's your definition you just read there. It is a great example of it trying to be a classification system or some sort, but totally non-serviceable, right? Like you said, there's a group that identifies as something that no one else can know about. Well, how can you the people who don't know about it use that classification system now to make any sort of positive action? Like
The other thing is you can't have an identity that is not negotiated with other people. Like your identity is not a top-down fiat model that you just impose willy-nilly on whoever you want. Like people.
And now don't say that to the Canadian government.
Well, yeah, we might actually go to jail for it at this point, but that's actually not actually like out of the realm of possibility, which is pretty ludicrous in my opinion, or any reasonable person's opinion. But yeah, like you don't negotiate, or you don't just force your identity as your gender upon anybody that you feel like. It's just not, you don't get to do that. You have to negotiate things. Like if somebody comes up to you and says like, I am Lord Rael and you must bow below, like, to me as a greeting, like you're just gonna say no, you don't. Like, yes, okay, that is your identity, but you don't get to impose that upon me. You just don't. Like, I'm not going to do these things. And I think that's one of the that's what it seems like to me, a lot of the gender stuff, when it turns into that.
Well, I know there's
outside of the spectrum or whatever else. It's like, well, no, you like nobody can relate to that, and they can't relate to it. And if they can't relate to it, they can't even negotiate this with you. And what you're saying is,
but again, that's where gender like completely goes off the rails. So, like you said, I agree with what you're saying on terms of like the negotiation. But even if you could say theoretically decide that people get to top down fiat determine their identities and broadcast them out to the world, and we just have to accept them. Like what Price was saying is like that you can only do that if everyone knows what you're broadcasting. If the identity that you've come up with is some esoteric, non-definable gobbledygook, well then even if you broadcast that high and wide and everyone buys into it, they're not going to have anything to do about that. They're like you say, I want to be treated as a non-spectrumed, I don't know what the terms are, amphora, gender, whatever, like that's off the spectrum and is a gender that is not known to humanity before now. Well, then it doesn't add anything to your identity because your identity is something that people have to interact with, and they have no new information about you in which to interact with given that gender definition. So going back to the reason like why I think gender is useless is like, okay, let's go back to sex. Like if we were to, out of quote unquote compassion, let people choose the sex that they want to be identified with, and say with trans, and you could have people who are transsexual and just they are born male sex, and they want to be treated as female sex. Why does gender need to come into it at all? Like, there's no room for these other genders that have no identity utility. They're completely irrelevant to your identity because they don't let the person who you're interacting with know anything about you.
And the one thing I want to add to Khan's point is I'm not entirely familiar with the terms, but I believe it's positive and negative rights and how they affect liberty, social liberty.
Yeah,
And
I know this. I know the terms you're talking about.
Yeah, so basically what they're trying to do is enforce people to act in a certain way, and that is not how liberty should work. It should be that you aren't repressed, but you don't get to tell other people how to act and live their lives. That's actually not liberty. That is now you're forcing them to do things. It's as long as you're going around not harming other people, you should be fine living your life, and that's like the Western ideal. But other people trying to demand that you treat them in certain ways is not in keeping with that.
Well, it's literally against core foundations of Canada and Western democracies, right? It's your nation is founded on the idea that you are free to do as you like, and you cannot impose upon others your own designs. Like, you don't get to just arbitrarily do that because you feel like it. You're right. You have a right to be protected, but you don't have a right to fling your fists around in any direction. Like, yes, you can fling your fists around in any direction and windmilling, but the second it comes in contact with somebody, then you are liable for assault and battery, and just a battery technically. And because what you're now doing is you're encroaching upon somebody else. And it's the same thing with this, this stuff saying, okay, you have to treat me in a particular way, even though it doesn't actually, even though, what it really is forced speech, which is, completely, the only places that do enforce speech are dictatorships. Like, that's literally
I think this is where there's sort of an attempt to actually subvert what people think about the terminology, because they want to make it as though misgendering an individual, which is only something that could recently be done and society has no framework for, but now misgendering an individual is equivalent in their eyes to attacking them. So it's like, you should be punished the same way you would if you walked up to someone in the street and gave them a death threat. It's like, well, no, these two things are definitely not equivalent. Misgendering someone, like, while they might feel bad about it, that's just not something that the world is, or like average people are capable of dealing with.
Yeah, and it's because you can also, again, like, especially if your gender is fluid or whatever else other thing you want to talk about, it means that you can change it at any moment. It means that opens up a huge avenue for abuse. Like, it's
every discussion would have to begin with an explanation of your pronouns, which just,
and that's what they already want. But the problem is,
I don't see that world coming to fruition.
Well, and that is actually what they want. Like, there's quite a push for that in the gender, in these gender camps to do that. And I think you actually see that, like, I'd honestly see some of this working too, right? Because they're trying to push people into using the pronouns all the time, and that is exactly where it's going.
The most bizarre part of it is that all of that is predicated on gender having some deep intrinsic meaning, which none of us were able to find.
No, I could not find, like, I'll talk more about mine, but, like, all I could find was a bunch of definitions that were all different depending on who was writing, and none of them, like a lot of them were just self-referential. Like they would just reference like your gender is your felt sense of gender, essentially. It's like, okay, like, and this is coming from even like the academics who produce this stuff.
Well, and I guess the other just bizarre thing about it all is I would assume these would be there's a lot of overlap between people who put a lot of emphasis on, correct pronoun usage and, you know, correctly gendering people, etc., etc., and people who also believe that men and women are essentially the same, and there should be no imposed gender roles or gender stereotypes or, you know, eh, basically any differential treatment or double standards between men and women, and men should be treated exactly the same as women in all circumstances and all
Yeah, well,
situations at all times.
they're the same. They're
So,
even the same physically in many ways. Like I
well,
remember seeing
leave
shit about.
leave that aside, as you know, because you can straw man people to death with stuff like that. But leaving all of that aside, um, if your proposition is that men and women should be treated equally and there should be no double standards, there should be no gender roles, and people should not be forced into stereotype, then what utility is gender anyway, and why even bother getting gender right? Because does it what aside from pronouns, what differential treatment would come about from you telling someone that you're male, female, agender, demigender, or whatever? Like, what actual difference, other than just a pronoun difference, what proposed difference does it make to you that you are that? Like, if you truly believe men and women should be treated the same, or all gender, quote unquote, all gender should be treated the same, then there's no differential treatment, and therefore the worst thing that can happen is a pronoun misuse, which seems at such a level infinitesimal amount of like harm and you know um inconsiderateness that it shouldn't even be considered a faux pas, really, let alone a crime,
I'll
because
hit you with the most wild and risque take is imagine if your goal was to have people treat other people as individuals. That's just I know it's a little too out there, but that would
That's
almost seem to solve this problem.
It's so funny because that is exactly where this always winds up, because in everything that I read, it's all about the personal truth and how you have to treat people personally, right? Or like treat them as the carriers of their personal truth, which is just silly speech for treat them as individuals, right? Like, and it's so odd that then the second you then speak about individual rights, or well, not even rights, but like depending on what type of rights or what type of actions that a society should take, they then become extremely collectivist. And it's so odd to me that like that is where they wind up. Like they harp on about like the individual all the time, and then they don't stop there. Like they just switch over to a very collectivist view of everything, depending on like what like really I think what like political leanings crop up.
yeah, I find it so strange that, like, what harm are you doing misgendering someone if essentially all genders should be treated and conceived of as identical, or identical under the law, identical in treatment, identical in, jobs and roles that they can take, right? If, a man can do whatever a woman can do, and a woman can do whatever a man can do, and an agender can do whatever either of them can do, then if you're misgendered, so what? It has no practical or meaningful implication for you, because no matter what gender you're perceived as or treated as, your treatment's going to be the same. And so what's the harm and what's the foul? Yes, I guess you could say it's slightly inconvenient that you got misgendered, or slightly annoying, but that's the worst. At that point, it's like someone, I don't know, mixing up something completely inconsequential about you. It's literally the same
I
as
I I think it's because
yeah,
they actually put it in like it becomes a deep part of their identity, and if they don't, uh,
But how can something that's not differentiated in society be a deep part of your identity is what I'm saying. It's like getting at that rate, it's like getting someone's name wrong. Like, would you make it a hate crime to use someone's name, the wrong name for them? If they call you John and your name's Jack?
yeah,
That's
you're
like
not, and if they keep doing it to piss you off, it's really frustrating. But it's no more frustrating than, or like
and
it's
but
no
that's like the
more
level of
criminal than.
pronouns are like at that point, like they are so inconsequential to you, or they should be given the logic behind what you know all genders being normatively the same and it being socially constructed anyway. So if there are any, if people are treating genders different, it's because they're bigots, not because there's any real reason for differential treatment, right? So it literally boils down to the level of, name mix up, which are you really going to get so mad that you're going to throw someone in jail over that? It's just bizarre.
Well, now might be the right time to introduce the fact that in many of these situations, there is also an aspect of mental illness, in which case some people might become physically aggressive if they're called the wrong name. And that would not be acceptable in society in general.
You mean, yeah, you mean getting physically aggressive over being misnamed is not
Yeah,
acceptable?
yeah, exactly. It's like shockingly, we already we already have social norms for that sort of stuff. And honestly, you do feel really bad if you call someone the wrong name.
Yeah, it's
Um,
not pleasant, but it's not. But if the person then switches their name halfway through the conversation, you know, and
but it's
then
that's what uh, the mental illness has really come in with the move towards increase in categorizing people as transgender in the Anglosphere, especially the UK. And along with the more people are classified as transgenders, there are also more people that are classified as transgender with additional mental illnesses. And that's
Well,
another thing is that if you call transgender mental illness, which it is, it's in the Diagnostic Standards Manual. People get super defensive about it, and it's like this is almost the exact same point you were making, in that these are the people who say there should be no stigma against mental illness, but then when you call something a mental illness and you have no ill will by calling it mental illness, it just means this person is experiencing difficulties with their life due to this aspect of their mental health, and they want that to be remedied, which is what a mental illness is. Or, I mean, they don't have to want it to be remedied, but it's causing them life altering difficulties. And it has no stigma attached to it, and yet they're the ones that will die defending the fact that transgender is not a mental illness, despite the
well,
fact that people have so many problems with it that they need to be treated for transgenderism. It's
I
just
would also, yeah, I was also gonna say they'd be the first ones to die on the hill of like transgenders have it the hardest. It is a constant daily struggle for them, right? So, just given your definition of mental illness, you'd think that's like hard.
textbook.
Yeah, textbook exactly. Like
yeah,
they would if you use that definition, they would 100. If you didn't say that was the definition of mental illness, you just said do trans people experience significant difficulties with their life due to their the issue of being trans, be like 100%. They're it's a horrible situation for them. It's they're discriminated against. They feel terror. Like they would nod their heads and vigorously saying like yes, of course it's a horrible thing for them. Um, and yet, yeah, they will say, "Well, it's not a mental illness." Well, it's like, okay, then what is it if it fits the definition of it? And uh, you know, yeah, exactly. It's that's another strange kind of sidebar on the whole situation, but that does bring up the broader point of like the transgender stuff seems to clash with a lot of the just gender stuff in my brain. Like I can never square the circle. It's like the transgender issue makes sense to me in the sense like if you use, if you yeah, if you tell me that there's people that are born male yet their brain tells them essentially that they're female or should be female, yeah, I'll buy that. But to say that they to say that there's these whole slew of other things that aren't male female that exist, and male and female are socially constructed anyway, then what really does being trans mean? Like, oh, you're born a male and you feel female. Well, female's socially constructed. Why does it matter if like how did you innately feel female? Like, were you conditioned to that? Were you born that way? Were you conditioned if it's socially constructed? Because in my mind, it just makes sense that it's like, you're born that way, and you have some whatever developmental issue or even genetic issue or something that causes your brain to essentially tell you that you're the opposite sex.
Yeah, so that's how like transgender was, well, and still is in academic circles understood, is that the person is born and they will experience gender dysphoria as a young child, starting around the age of 3 or 4, and they'll continue to have gender dysphoria until they hit around puberty, and then the majority of people with gender dysphoria reconcile to their sex, so their gender and sex line up, and I'm not entirely certain if it's a 50-50 split or if the majority end up being homosexual in their adult life, but it's
the
close to a
majority,
50-50
I think.
split. Okay. Yeah, so the majority that reconcile
If
with
it's
their...
not, sorry, I'll correct myself. I think it's a majority, but if it's not a majority, it's a large plurality. Like it's the largest chunk.
The smallest chunk, and I think if I recall correctly, it was around 10 to 20% of children who grow up their childhood with gender dysphoria from around 3 years old to 13 or so. About 10 to 20% of them will end up being diagnosed as transgender.
Yeah, it's the
And
smallest
that is the way
portion
that
of
it's been,
gender dysphoric people.
and that's the way that's been understood for 50 years, 60 years, at least in psychology. And
Yeah, but all that
now
old psychology stuff is just sexist and transphobic garbage anyways. So
yeah, well, now in recent years, they are trying to, and succeeding in some countries, to remove the requirement for diagnosis in childhood of gender dysphoria, so that a perfectly non-gender dysphoric child who becomes a teenager can then at 14 or 15 claim to be transgender, and that is supposed to be accepted. And that's not how psychology has ever worked, and that is a social movement that is being pushed by, at best, philosophers, and at worst, like journalists or
it's
I don't
also
know,
corporations. Like I was doing some research on it, and there's actually there's a part of the LGBT community, quote unquote community, but they call themselves LGBT Fight Back because they kind of see these problems of, you're actually transitioning a lot of what would become gay people, and they find that to be, let's say, problematic. But they point out that there's a ton of money to be made in transgender surgeries and hormones and whatnot. And I went and looked it up, and it can be in the States. It can be like, if you're going to do the whole gamut of the hormones and the surgeries, it's anywhere from like $60,000 to $100,000, even more. Depends on how much you need, right? And yes, it could be a bit lower too. Like maybe it's only going to cost 20, but you're looking at very serious sums of cash. And I think there is actually, what I actually find the funniest part of all that is if it's ever mentioned, like, the profit motive is a problem here. The mental gymnastics that people go through to say, no, there's no profit motive here at all. That is ridiculous. When the left particularly loves to scream about how, like, these same people will scream about like how the profit motive is ruining everything. Capitalism is like ruining things, and yet there's no.
This is the one thing it got perfectly,
Exactly.
absolutely,
It's
100%.
It's
correct.
no word of it, no nothing, and if you mention it, off with your head. And it's quite interesting that is the response that I noticed. It's, like there's no way that it could possibly be the profit motive for making $100,000 per kid that you do the transitions for. And that's not including, like, you have to do sometimes like follow-up visits. And a lot of the transgendered people, you actually wind up with a lot more medical issues and attention, like not just the surgeries. You're going to have to go in for other follow-ups because a lot of the surgeries, they're very major. You are going to have to get things, quote unquote, touched up, or you might have other medical problems that then require treatment, that then you have to go to your specialist who gave you all of this. And in the States, like, you can be a 15-year-old in, I think it's Washington State, and you can get all of this done with no permission from your parents whatsoever. And that's it. Like, that's all you need. And these doctors...
It's useful to note that this is very much a problem that's dominant in the Anglosphere, the English-speaking world, and that the rest of the world is lagging behind and often refusing to adopt measures like that, where children can be their own guarantors of having a terrible life-altering mental illness. And even American states have been moving against that and making it so that even the parents can't consent to transgender reassignment surgery until the child is over the age of 17, I believe, in Arkansas.
I do think that...
doesn't seem like you would need to make it a law, but in this day and age, you definitely need to make it a law. It's bizarre.
Yeah, I mean, the trans stuff is like such a... It's
another whole other issue.
Yeah, a whole side tangent that always gets lumped in with, obviously, and I think a lot of the fuel for the fire in terms of sex and gender does come from the trans movement, and a lot of people cynically do use trans activism to push their own, opinions or voice on gender issues. But again, to me, it comes back to, like, say, the trans issue, like, what, like, the terminology again is just, it seems intentionally confusing, and gender just seems like a straight downgrade of what we were working with. Like ask yourself if sexual identity is less useful than gender identity, or sex expression is less useful than gender expression.
Yeah, I think sex expression, because they also now siphon out, like, they make sure to siphon out sexual orientation, which they say is completely unrelated to any of this at all. It's not related to your sex or your gender or anything.
Does the terminology, like, do you gain anything from going from sexual identity in terms of male identity, female identity, and that could differ from your born sex. Your identity could differ from your born sex, fair enough. We'll grant that. That jives completely and leaves room for transsexual individuals, or do you get anything going to gender and saying, oh, well, now I'm using my gender identity? Well, it just does, to me, there's no meaningful distinction there. And the only thing that really happens is, like Price was showing before, you can smuggle in a bunch of more genders that don't really seem to correspond to anything, even a lot of them relating to sex at all. In fact, a lot of the straight definitions of those genders specifically mention that they have nothing to do with the masculine feminine spectrum, or the traditional gender spectrum at all. They're off of it. Well, then, what is even the point of having that as, a part of sex? Like, they now they no longer correspond. Like, now you're talking, like you guys said at the beginning of the podcast, now you're talking something closer to personality. If it's not in any way, shape, or form related to the sexual spectrum or the gender spectrum or whatever you want to call it, and you're off the spectrum, well, then it's not related, and it's a different thing.
It's an entirely different thing.
You're talking about your conscientiousness levels, or your neuroticism, most likely neuroticism.
Yeah.
Like, it's something different, and it just completely confuses the conversation and makes everyone, lose sight of what is actually getting talked about or what should be getting talked about, and
And a
completely
direct
unhelpful.
example of that is that there are schools, and this is from The Economist, so I'm certain that it's true, that there are schools that teach gender identity in the classroom as identified by introspection and not anatomy. Therefore, if they're leaders and rational, they are boys, and if they're nurturing and gossipy, they are girls.
I
And
saw
that's
that.
how a school will actually teach the idea of gender.
It's so funny. So I actually have a comment on this, and it's just a silly one, but I honestly kind of feel like some of this stuff is the collective unconscious trying to reassert more traditional gender roles because they're sick and tired of all the weirdness, and they're just saying, okay, well, none of this crap makes sense, so let's just like reassert actual old school gender roles because that actually, at least that made some damn sense. Like all of this other stuff, just like it doesn't make any sense to us, and so people are using it to reassert like the traditional gender roles.
And in a dark timeline, what you'll often see on the internet is comparisons with Weimar Germany, because Weimar Germany, which was the Germany between Imperial Germany and Nazi Germany, which was a democracy, was basically a world leader in sexual research and understanding transsexualism. It, they pretty much had very similar gender constructs to what you see now, where it became very muddied, and then the response to that was the Nazi Party coming in and destroying the Institute of Sexual Research, as they called it, which was doing this research, and burning all of the
No
books.
way. They weren't receptive to the the muddy
And then you
gender.
had, yeah, and then you had how
Wait.
of,
Sorry, like the
or
the
no, 12 years of a country that reverted to the most traditionalist gender norms they could come up with.
oh, okay,
which
I see. So
included
so the Nazis took over and switched it over to the really heavy duty.
No, the
yeah, so
Nazis came in and made it super progressive. They were like, let's get the double the funding for trans research.
Let's not just gas them.
Let's
yeah, so
you know,
that was a term or a sort of area where you see there was an enormous pushback in politics that was what is the term, reactionary, much further right wing than conservative or traditionalist, and they went back to an idealistic history where women stayed at home and raised children, and men went out and fought world wars.
well, and I think that's a good point in the sense like if this was confined to esoteric academic journals where 40-year-old marginally successful academics were discovering their gender identities and deeply detailing them in these journal articles and talking about the differences between gender role and blah 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 and just um, basically sucking themselves off academically, then whatever. Like I don't think
Yeah,
that's.
it's just
I
you
mean,
dicking around with your own like inner
it's
spiritual
exploring
journey, right?
your identity or whatever, and you're doing it through a journal article where peers are also going to read about it and whatever. But the like trying to like take that and rip it out of academia and then shove it through rest of society so that you have elementary students trying to learn about gender expression, like, oh, surprisingly 5-year-olds can't absorb the nuance of critical theory. Like they don't understand when you tell them that penis doesn't mean boy and and vagina doesn't mean girl. They don't absorb the deep nuances of gender theory, and they get confused, and they
Then they
you know
start getting transitioned in insane numbers that
well,
have never been seen before, and will likely.
even besides that, they just get confused about what it means to be a boy and what it means to be a girl, and they don't I don't think there's any you, you could see there being some utility in teaching boys and girls to explore a boy and girl identity until at least they're a little bit older, and seeing if it fits. Like it doesn't seem like there's a huge amount of harm that's going to come to 99% of the children doing the traditional way of exploring your what you were born as,
Well,
And
and shockingly, you don't even have to teach them. If you do nothing, children as young as the age of 2 or 3 will begin exploring their gender identity, which is why children that don't can be diagnosed with gender dysphoria that young, because they're obviously going through a different gender experience than their peers.
exactly. So it just doesn't seem like there was any ever a need to shove this out into, mainstream conversation in general, and schools and children especially. Like, it's it, if academics can't seem to nail it down and agree on definitions and agree on what things mean, how do they expect broader society to absorb the nuance and all of a sudden be enlightened gender theorists that can nimbly navigate through these types of topics
I
and
don't think
without
many people,
backlash.
even the academics, navigate through it nimbly. It's extraordinarily,
Exactly.
Well,
It's
and then
not
when
a clear-cut, easy to teach topic at the
and
very
it's
least.
also like we were saying, it's very like individualistic, and they have like the definitions are different for every single person. They can argue about it all day long, right? So I just feel like
Well, and that, I guess my point is, when your average Joe throws his hands up in there and says, this whole gender nonsense, I don't get it. I don't like it. Journalists are, quick to jump on the story of, like, oh, there's some
Joe
bigot
Blow
that's
from Arkansas said something
some
trans or gender phobic.
the bigots are, discriminating again. They're out in force. They're trying to kill trans people. This silence is violence and words are violence, and they're attacking, and they want all trans people dead. Blah blah. It's like, it's no wonder your average Joe throws their hands up there and goes, I don't get what the fuck's going on, and I don't like any of it because,
Well,
for my
none of it actually makes any sense. Like if you just
and their whole life, sex as a basic category system worked perfectly fine, and most of them, I'm sure, if you gave them some time to absorb it, would be reasonably amenable to your basic trans issue of some males prefer to be identified as females, and some females prefer to be identified as males.
yeah,
If
I would
that's where
say
you
the
left it at,
majority of people don't actually have a problem with
I
that.
think not if you left it at that, and that was what you're bringing to the table. 90% of people would eventually be like, okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, like
I don't. It's not. I don't 100% get it, but if that makes them feel better, or if that's what they
no
prefer to
skin
do,
off,
or
like no skin off my back. Like
Well,
I don't care.
the other thing that's never seems to be brought up is that in the modern day, with modern technology, trans people will become passable, and no, like people don't even have to know whether they're male or female. They'll perceive them as the gender that they express, and that's all it is. Like, and that's the goal of traditionally the goal of transitioning trans people with hormones and sexual reassignment is that outside of intimate relations, you go through life as your felt sex.
Well, that was one of the things that I always felt the whole transgender issue. Like, I know this is a little bit off topic of gender, but unless you're a complete buffoon, you understand what's going on. I guess this makes sense with the pronouns, but when you notice somebody who's transitioning, unless you're a complete buffoon, you understand what's going on for the most part, and you should be able to handle it appropriately. Like any reasonable adult can say, okay, I've noticed what's going on here. Somebody is transitioning. It looks like most likely, male to female. Yes, okay, there's going to be some mistakes made, but it's male to female. I'll use female pronouns. Bam, I don't even done. And that person is now going into the bathroom, like the female bathroom, and they're clearly on that track of transitioning. Yeah, nobody cares. Unless you're really truly, I think that was the way it was dealt with before, right? Because it wasn't like transgender people did not exist until 5 years ago. It's so I feel like that was it just wasn't even bothered to be talked about because it was I think for most people it was just obvious. You didn't worry about it.
Well, I do think it's not. I think depending on the circles you run in, it's obvious. Other circles it would be not so obvious, or
Yeah, you
I
even
might
mean,
have some.
I would certainly make mistakes unless the person was obviously one gender or the other. But I think that's the case for most people. But usually, that's not the goal. It's not to be ambiguous. The goal is to
Yeah,
pass in society.
it's for
well, I guess
transgenders for
what I
sure.
mean is, you're gonna have certain religious groups or whatever that the whole trans thing is just a non-starter
Yeah,
completely, right? And they're gonna be diehard opposed to it till the day they blink out of existence. And say in the U.S. that might not be actually an insignificant portion of the population. It might be a somewhat sizable minority. Um, that being said, like I just y- you know I think the main point is like all the terminology and extra um, confusion around gender is actually just really damaging for. I think
your
it's
regular
damaging
trans.
to discourse in general because no one can agree on even what the words are, and then yeah, it's damaging to certain groups. I think it hurts. I think it hurts pretty much a ton of minority groups, including like the whole spectrum of LGBT, like because it just delegitimizes that whole side of things because it just gets all lumped in, right? It's very easy for someone who isn't well versed on it or doesn't really understand it to just say, like, oh well, that whole like gender nonsense. That's all that comes out of the LGBT movement, right? That's just part and parcel. They're always pushing nonsense like that. I poo-poo it all. I give up on it all.
Yeah, I don't want
It's
anything
all
to do
a
with
crock of
it. They're
shit.
all like, fuck
You
that
know
entire community.
Well,
exactly
especially
because
boomers when they go on their Facebook because they're the only ones who still use it, and they see there's 50 plus gender options, and it's like that's helping nobody because when I looked at that, there's like 5 real ones, and even that is going to be a meme among boomers. But when you make it 50, like that's definitely just going to be the butt of a million jokes.
Yeah, it's just
and
gonna
it's
be
it's
more
too
people who
easy
are
to
being.
yeah, it's too easy to attribute it to a broader set of people. Like I would say, I would say a sizable percentage of of any minority group just doesn't buy into it either, right? Like, but I think this does come back to a lot of like it always all leads roads lead to Rome. Well, in this case, all roads lead to fucked up mainstream media and the internet ruining things, which 50 genders is something that a journalist can get a lot of clicks on in an article, right? And therefore, a lot of these things I think get spiraled out of their little niche communities where they're invented and broadcast far and wide just because they generate controversy um, and discussion and clicks, right? So it's obviously I think if you talk to real people in real life and you explained a certain amount of that stuff, they would be much more receptive to kind of a center ground that is reasonable.
One thing I thought that I didn't see in any of the articles I read, but I learned in the gender course that I took. Well, I trust that this academic research is relatively accurate, and they'll go around the world quantifying the strength of gender roles. And the West has had quite a significant decrease in the strength of the female gender role. So basically, like uh, expectations of what women do and how women should behave in society are very unclear in the Western world, whereas they remain quite clear in most of the rest of the world. And that males are also headed down a similar track of lack of clarity of the male gender role. And in the gender studies course, that was viewed as this great achievement.
I
But
think
it
that's
makes you
pretty
wonder.
harsh on society, though.
It makes you wonder if a lot of this gender discussion is genuinely a result of the breakdown of gender roles and sort of a there's people casting about for a new gender role that'll fit the new society that we live in, because the old ones are broken down and irreparable, in a sense that maybe we do need a new masculine stereotype for the collective that we haven't found yet, and that in the interim it's this sort of messy ambiguity, meaningless, and like people are throwing darts at the dartboard, and one day it'll hit and people will be like, wait, that makes sense, and we'll find a new paradigm. I feel like people like the term like paradigms and stuff, so I'm surprised that I looked for that briefly and couldn't find anyone really talking about it.
Yeah, well, I think most people, they just, like, in the gender study academic realm, they don't want new gender roles. It's a breakdown of all the gender roles, because it's all, an ambiguous like mess. But I do think that actually is a part
narratives.
Well, actually, this is actually exactly in line with my point from earlier, where I do think it's like the gender roles trying to come back, like people like unconsciously or subconsciously reaching out into into the nether to try to find new roles. Like they're trying to, or having the old ones reassert themselves, right? I think what honestly would need to happen is like properly defined gender roles do need to be exhibited or like rebuilt into the society, because I think both men and women, you have to do way too much thinking if you don't have a gender role. Like it's so much extra work. You have to negotiate all the fucking time, right? And that, I feel, is just, most people are not up to that task. Like it's just way too difficult to constantly have to negotiate the terms, like the societal contract. Now, I don't think that's not to say that, okay, well, let's just go right back to the old one and, the Industrial Revolution one and call her a day. But, like there probably needs to be some actual conversations about it that are self-aware of it, rather than just, because I do think that there is a bit of like subconscious, unconscious flailing around in the dark for it. I think you're right. I've been thinking about it for a while.
Well, I think that's true. Although I think, like we were saying towards the beginning, biology will just assert itself, right? In the sense, like, a lot of the quote unquote gender roles that existed in, say, Industrial Revolution, in the same vein, they assert themselves today, right? It's just not as explicit, right? It's all implicit, and a lot of the time it's like, how would you put it? Society says one thing but does another.
Yeah.
Where you're told in pop culture, whatever. Well, in certain propagandistic parts of pop culture, oh well, it's okay to be this way or that way, as a a man or a woman, even though you're a man or a woman. But when the rubber meets the road, it's not actually okay to be that way. And one of the things you can see, one of the ones that you can see with that is, like, I don't think anyone would really call it acceptable to be an unemployed male.
Yeah, well, no woman is ever going to be like thrilled about that, right?
It's just like no one's gonna, you're 35 and you have no job and you have nothing else going on. There's even terms for that now, NEETs, not in education. What is it? Education,
employment or
training,
as coined by the British government. God bless.
Yeah, exactly. Like NEETs, like no one sits there and says that's a totally acceptable role for you to fill in society, and we applaud you for it, and keep going and keep collecting the government bennies and never change.
But I think that, well, firstly, this does get back to the internet, because on the internet you can certainly find people that will support you in that, and whatever other degenerate mental health issues you have, you can find support to make them worse on the internet. But also, I think that that goes in general. I like, while it's definitely more unacceptable for males, it's just, I think, not acceptable in general as well. So it
But
becomes
it's so much more acceptable for a woman. And you can do the math in your head, right? So say you knew a quote unquote 22-year-old neat female and a 22-year-old neat male, and you had a niece and nephew of similar age, and you were going to set up a blind date. Um, you might be totally okay with setting your nephew up with the unemployed female, but you're probably not okay setting up your niece with the unemployed male. It would just be different. It would be a different circumstance. Like, oh, and you go say you do set up both those dates, and they happen. It's just that I can't even fathom the difference in conversation where the girl says, oh yeah, I just kind of been since high school. I just been kind of traveling around and you know doing my own thing, hanging out. Haven't really done anything, and I don't really have any plans to do anything
Just depends on
in the
how hot she
future.
is.
Yeah, and she's let's assume she's average looking, and so is the guy. Like, and that's a conversation. That's probably a second date, unless she's a total weirdo. That's a second date. The guy says, "Yeah, I just haven't done anything since high school. I have no plans to do anything ever, in my future. I think it's kind of welfare for me until I die." I don't think that's a second date.
I'm
Like,
just gonna say this, like, you have too much faith in women. Like, you'd be surprised. Like, obviously, I know where you're coming from. There's definitely a differential there, but there are way too many women that are accepting of deadbeats these days.
I think
maybe
that's just
that's
because there's so many deadbeats that
well, I
we
think.
legitimately
The,
they
the,
just
the
kind of
the
have
whole
to now.
bar is just so much lower.
That's true. The bar is low, but still, like it is a different situation. But anyway, my going back to the original kind of point, there is one guy that I've actually heard talk about this a little bit, not in maybe exactly the same terms. Warren Farrell. He was actually involved highly in the feminist movement in the beginning, and then he's actually been like involved in basically advocating for boys recently. And two
Yeah,
parent
he was a big
households.
feminist for a long time.
Yeah, yeah, he got his chops as a feminist, and he wrote his PhD on um, something female empowerment related. Anyway, his I guess proposition, or so to speak, is you need to frame you need to make it in our kind of gender normless or less gender norms era, you need to utilize like that biological imperative that the different sexes have, and make it. He comes at it for boys. That's more of his thing, and he says like, yes, gender norms have changed and gender roles have kind of changed, but you can still leverage, like
The current
um,
societal
this.
structures,
No, you can, well, and you can still leverage the sex's innate like kind of
proclivities.
differences or whatever. And one way he says, or one of his examples is you could make it kind of be seen as heroic to be a father, right? In the sense, like, we kind of had a heroism around, say, military service, and a heroism around, providership, in terms of economic providership, going to work. Well, father, you could do the same with being a good father, being a present and attentive father. And I think some of that's a little bit uh,
I think some.
optimistic, but I think there's some truth in that. I think you could broaden the gender roles while still utilizing a lot of the innate differences to their most advantage, to make, you know, to provide the asymmetric incentives that the different sexes operate on.
Yeah, and one of the big things in a future where gender roles come roaring back, I think, would be an understanding of the general personality difference between the sexes and like what motivates the sexes differentially. So you'd find a way to incentivize good fathership through what males actually respond to in general.
And
And then
that's
that could
Farrell's
go
point
through
in a
the
nutshell, for sure.
yeah, and that could then, if it was a natural incentive structure, then actually disseminate through the whole society.
And I think he would, I don't want to mind read him too much, but this is kind of the understanding I got, and this is kind of what I think makes sense is like you do want gender roles to be a little less strict than they were, well, probably significantly less strict than they were in, say, you know, early industrial times, where it was very, very rigid. Women were just straight up banned from multitudes of professions. But at the same
Education or politics or anything.
exactly, and men, had certain other rigidities around their gender roles of
Yeah, go die in
that
a war, bitch. You get no choice.
I
yeah,
mean,
you
that
get
was
trapped.
really one of the first things that like shook the foundations of the industrial gender role was the First World War. So, oh, wow, dying in a ditch does not feel as good as they told me it would. Like,
Yeah,
It
you really?
wasn't as glorious as they said it might be, being dead in a bunch of mud and halfway across the world.
Man, I saw like the colorized photos of the result of a German attack on an English trench in World War One, and it's just like some poor bastard, like probably 19 years old, and he's just half covered in mud, dead, and there's like a couple English soldiers sitting beside him, and just watching him rot. It's just like Jesus Christ, man. To imagine to go through that is just, yeah, definitely, definitely a no for me for any of that type of stuff.
Yeah, and so going back to the gender roles, you'd want them to be less rigid, but um, still still have, say, male hierarchy incentives that best bring out, you know, male achievement striving and stuff like that
Yeah,
too. So, and same for women, right? You'd want the gender roles structured such that they still do, um, like you were saying, solve some of the societal navigation for people, yet also motivate them adequately.
yeah, yeah. I absolutely agree.
I mean, I think we covered a lot of shit so far. Is there any other points you guys want to hit on?
that's most of what I was thinking about.
No, yeah, I think that's everything for me, really.
Yeah, yeah, that about does it for me. I just think gender is a stupid term. We should get rid of it.
Yeah, and
What
just
the French do it. It's all
well,
sex.
get rid of that, and just get rid of all of the accompanying nonsense that comes with it, like all of that theory around it as well from the universities. It's not helping anybody.
Well, and I think just like a practical thing, just like ask people to define what they mean constantly.
Yeah,
Like
I actually think that's a really good tactic.
if you're dealing with people and they're throwing around, different genders and gender, gender role, blah 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 blah, just constantly ask for definitions and write them down and record them, and
Watch the
that
whole thing unravel.
yeah, you need to because it eventually, unless they are either they'll be completely unwilling to give you any sort of definition, which I think is useful in itself because it illustrates the fact that it's not a very tenable, practical endeavor. If you're say it's in a workplace and they're saying, "Oh, we can't define any of these things for you," and then it's like, "Okay, well then why are you bringing them into the workplace? Not not necessary. Not get it out." And if they will define them, eventually they will contradict themselves and tie themselves into knots. At which case you can also point that out and be like, "Well, you said five different contradictory things in terms of gender, the definition of gender itself. What do I believe? What do you believe? Like, help
Or
me out."
you might find the self-consistent theory that will soon become the society-wide new gender norms, and you're on the cutting edge, so works out.
True. You might square the circle, solve the problem, and just because you ask for definitions.
Yeah, never know.
It happened.
One can only hope. All right. Well, that's it for me.
Peace.
Peace.
Peace.